This is my game room. There's a ping pong table, arcade game, cat door, and over in the corner I had built some hanging shelves to store games on. The project is a redo of those shelves. There are now too many games to fit. I'm a little worried about this rope breaking, and some of the shelves are sagging and not level. We're going to upgrade to 4 shelves instead of 3, and I'm going to use 1/2-inch plywood instead of the 1/4 inch that's currently there. And we're going to change out this rope for steel wire. Those screw hooks are importantly screwed into the framing of the house. The old shelves were 21 inches wide and 12 inches deep. The new shelves are also going to be 21 inches wide but varying width. The top one's going to be about 9, then a 12, then 15, and finally an 18-inch shelf. My table saw objected to the 18-inch cut. Don't wear flip-flops. I'm also cutting 1/2-inch wide strips of pine. This is a 3/4 inch board, and those are going to be used to hide the plywood edges. Because the strips are thicker than the plywood, it's going to be hard to sand the bottom of the shelves after they're applied, so I'm doing that first. 2 of the 4 shelves are a lower grade plywood, so I'm having to fill those with wood filler before I sand. The way I try to get a good fit of those edge strips to the plywood is to cut a 45-degree miter on each of them, and then hold them up to the edges of the plywood and mark where the other miter needs to be. It's not perfect, but it gets you close. I always end up having to trim some of the pieces more than once to get them to fit. So we end up with 16 of those. We need to glue 4 on each shelf. Because they poke down a little bit off the bottom of the shelf, I find it's easier to glue up if you put the shelf on something thin to make up the difference. Here I'm using a 1/4 inch piece of plywood. The good side of the plywood is facing up. I'm applying glue to the edge pieces where it will meet the plywood, and including the miter corners where the pieces will meet each other. I'm going to use clamps to hold these pieces in place until they dry. You could use a brad nailer, but I find that the clamps make it easier to push and pull the edge pieces to get them as flush with the top of the plywood as possible. And finally, if any glue squeezes out, you can just wipe that off with a wet paper towel. The only shelf that I did differently was the very top one. Because that one's going to be higher in the air, you're more likely to see the bottom of the shelf than the top, so I'm putting the bad side of the plywood facing up. With the clamps off, I put wood filler all around the seams and on the mitered corners. After it dries, I use 240 grit sandpaper on an orbital sander to get everything smooth. For the edges and corners, the orbital sander is a little too aggressive, so I just hand sand those. Here are our 4 shelves. I'm going to paint them the same color as the accent wall in that game room. After the first coat of paint, which can raise the grain on the wood, I give it a light sanding by hand to get it smooth again. On one of the lower quality shelves, the grain was raised quite a bit, so I had to go back and use the orbital sander on that. I ended up doing 3 coats on the top and 2 coats on the bottom. Because this is an eggshell sheen paint, it scuffs very easily, and when we put games on it and take them off, it'll just look terrible after a short while. So to the tops of the shelves, I'm adding this polyacrylic water-based protectant. I do 2 coats of that on each shelf. If you wanted to skip this step, you could just use semi-gloss paint, which doesn't scuff nearly as easily. One of the problems with the original design was that the rope wasn't very sturdy. So for this round, I'm going to use vinyl-coated 1/8 inch steel wire. It's got a 340-pound rating, which is far in excess of what we need. It's 30 feet long. I've marked it in the middle to cut it into 2 halves using a metal blade on an angle grinder. To support the shelves, I'm going to use these U-bolts in the corner, 4 for each shelf. I will put a link in the description to the ones I bought off of Amazon. I'm using a jig to make sure the holes I drill in the shelves are all in the same place, and I'm using a drill bit that is just slightly wider than the cable itself. So here are our 4 new shelves compared to the 3 original ones. The 3 original ones I did not put a lot of time or work into. It obviously shows. I'm happy with how these 4 turned out. We have 2 15-foot lengths of cable. I'm using one of those feeding the end through the holes on the left side of the shelves, and the other end of that same 15-foot cable down the holes on the right side of the shelves. And then at the bottoms of the 2 ends of the cable, I am tightening on U-bolts. I measure up a foot from each of those U-bolts, which is where the next U-bolt is going to be. Pull the cable through the bottom shelf and then attach those next 2 bolts. In retrospect, I think there's an easier way to do this, and that is mark the cable first and then go ahead and thread it through a shelf and also a U-bolt, then a shelf, also a U-bolt, and so on. In either case, what you end up with is a U-bolt under each of the shelves on the left side, each of the shelves on the right, and then you just repeat that whole process for the other side of the shelves. I had a couple places where the U-bolt was not facing the right direction. If you run into that or the shelf is not quite level, it's easy just to loosen the U-bolt, put it in the right position, and retighten. I got everything to fit except for these items. And for those, I'm going to take a small strip of wood, screw it to the bottom of the bottom shelf, and into that I'm going to screw little hooks that I can hang them from. That is the end. I'm happy with it. I am no longer in fear that the shelves will buckle or the rope will break. And I think the pyramid design is a little bit cooler than the last one.